Delivering clear, concise, and entertaining content on demand, this is sharpertalkmedia.com. Join the community. Welcome to Higher Up, the podcast designed to help you take your business to a higher level.
Get the latest news and updates on everything human resources.
Unlock the occupational DNA so you can identify, select, develop, and retain top talent.
And now your host, John Beck.
Our guest today is a multilingual assessment specialist with over 15 years of experience analyzing psychometric and workforce data. He's assisted hundreds of companies all over the globe in implementing HR software. He's used statistical trend line analysis to translate assessment results into a language of employee job performance. President of Kunze Analytics, LLC, he's recently worked for 4 years in R&D at John Wiley & Sons Workplace Learning Solutions Division, where there he leveraged geometrical workforce and client data to publish a library of 139 job-related performance models for PXT Select Certified Partners and their clients. He is known for calculating ROI. Finally, he enjoys the challenges of optimizing performance model validity by writing software code in SPSS syntax and Excel visual-based languages. Our guest today, the great ROI master, Chris Kunze. Welcome to the show.
Hey, John. Great to be here.
Chris, missed you, man. I'm so excited to have you back on the show today at Higher Up.
Yeah, fantastic. No, it's when you invited me to do it, I thought, hey, this is really great, and good to chat again after a little bit of time.
And Chris, you and I go way back. In fact, Chris and I worked together at with an organization, Profiles International, for years and years in different capacities and different working relationships.
Right. And
we also had you come in, and we did a real nice dinner. You remember that?
I sure do. Yeah.
That's right. At a famous hummus house restaurant, which was fantastic. A little plug for those guys, right? So, Chris, for those of you who know you, and I know that we have tons of folks that do who listen in, give us a little background on what you've been up to recently, and tell me a little bit about your new business.
Okay, sure. Well, Kunze Analytics, I've gone back into consulting 100%, something that I did at the beginning of my career with assessments in the early 2000s. And I had been introduced to assessments in the 80s as a student. And then in the 1990s, when I was working in Germany as an instructor, I would have meetings with students twice a month, and I would use my appraisal of their personality, and I'd adapt my communication style. So then actually in the 2000s, I began working here in Madison, Wisconsin, selling assessments and helping companies improve the quality of their hiring. And then was hired by the company, the Profiles International, and worked for many years in the client services department. So with hundreds of companies globally. That relationship with Profiles International and Wiley ended in February. Mm-hmm. And I had actually expressed about a year ago that I really wanted to get back into consulting. So it was a good thing where I am right now. And I asked myself, I probably should have done it a few years earlier, but
right,
setting up the company and getting everything set up to go. I just got back from SIOP last week in Chicago. There were 5,500 attendees and 60 vendors, and just a lot going on there. I met two academicians whose papers I've read and appreciated. There was a Korean professor there And he works at a university in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
And then another Swedish professor was there, and I talked with both of them. I just, latched on for about a half hour to 45 minutes with each one, and we talked about performance, job performance, and predicting.
Right.
And that's what my company does.
Yeah.
I predict as well as possible and try to give a solution that is really valid. And I translate the language of psychometrics and testing and assessments and personality, cognitive interests into their metrics of interest.
So what I want to let the audience know, and this is what a great opportunity to be able to introduce your type of service to organizations, because a lot of companies use employee assessments, as we all know, and the days of doing it because everyone else is doing it, or doing it because putting assessments in because it makes us all feel like we're doing something within our organization, I think those days are gone. And
to just like check a box and say, okay, well, we do we have assessments.
I mean, now organizations are looking for that return, and which leads me right into, over the last 15 years and, the R&D that you've done, and what are the main insights that you've taken away from that perspective? Meaning, organizations have to have that return, that ROI. How does Kunze Analytics go about that process? I mean, what are the main takeaways that you've gotten over the last 15 years that bring you to where you are today?
Yeah, well, validity is the most important issue in selecting an assessment. And that's what we measure. So, we're expecting that once we purchase an assessment, we get it set up in our system, we get people trained and start assessing candidates or employees for whatever business outcomes, that it's going to make a difference. It's going to move the needle. It's going to impact the bottom line. And we're going to get, positive result from all the money and time and effort, sweat equity that we put into these systems. And it's really important. What validity does, it's not just about the instrument itself. It's got to be well built. It's got to be peer reviewed in the technical manuals, and they have to do all of the number crunching behind the scenes to make sure they're publishing a good product. And most companies are publishing good products today.
Right.
The thing is, though, when you apply it, okay, are you going to pick a model from the library? Are you going to assess some people in your company that are in a particular high impact position? Are you going to add their assessment results to the model? It's about that performance model.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you're using that, all the questions come up. Well, is the current model that I'm using, is that valid? Do I need to tweak it? Do I need to change it? Do I need to optimize it? Or is it now the time I absolutely have to, because it's only got usefulness that's, depends upon the circumstances. I'd like it to be more valid, likely to be useful, or very beneficial, as the government, the Department of Labor, would interpret validity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in the end, John, we want to know the degree to which we can make specific conclusions and even predict how people are going to function in their position based upon the assessment scores. It's all about prediction. If you can't predict, you're missing a step.
Yeah.
And then the last part of that once you've done all that work, then you're able to basically quantify in dollars and cents the value of the whole solution.
Dollars and cents. That leads me right into, on your LinkedIn profile, I noticed that when we're talking about dollars and cents, you have, and I love it, the Master ROI Tool Maker. Huh? You like that? I love it.
Oh, that comes from my wife. She said, "What are you going to call yourself? How are you going to?"
And that's you led right into it. I mean, dollars and cents, and is there ROI, and how can organizations truly discover the ROI, the value in using assessments at the end of the day? Because that's really what it's all about. I mean, we can use it to make us feel like we're doing something, and we talked about the uselessness of that. But when an organization can take that data and be able to correlate it to whether it's turnover or production or whatever the business need is, and then equate that to some type of ROI, then now organizations are really starting to get the full benefit of using the technology. Is that basically? So tell me, toolmaker.
Yes, it is.
Right?
Well, people, for years, human resource professionals are pretty good at estimating costs. Their CFO is going to be asking for that information anyway, and they'll know what it costs to hire and train a new employee, right? So that's pretty well quantified. But when they implement an assessment system as a solution, they are able to speak, the HR department, professionals, executives, to speak with the end line managers or whoever has the profit and loss, the P&L responsibility for critical positions, critical roles. And then they can capture those performance metrics that are involved with those roles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Typically, you kind of marry two different things. You'll have more objective key performance indicators that are already in dollars and cents. If it's a sales or service position in a company, it's going to be gross revenue, net profit, number of accounts that, they'll know the average value per account. And in servicing, the retention of their clients, the expansion of growth within existing business, all of those metrics companies know down to the detail.
Right.
It's not that they don't have that. They don't know how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
So then what we do is, and they'll also have more subjective kind of key performance indicators that aren't always quantified, annual performance appraisal data, or they might have these new type of very quick surveys, pulse surveys and responses from their employees to gauge different characteristics, right?
Right.
That can all be quantified in dollars and cents based upon the mean annual compensation of the employee. So once we have those data, which are objective and subjective, and some companies will like to say, well, I'd like the performance model to predict, sales volume.
Mm-hmm.
And the other metrics we have, 2, 3, 4 metrics, okay, we're interested in them. We just want to know how the model will impact those metrics.
Right.
But we're really interested in one. Okay, then we build the model so that it's highly predictive of sales volume. And in a correlation table, we show them how it's likely to impact those other metrics of interest.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are other clients, and that's already in dollars and cents, right? So
right.
For every percent increase, John, in assessment fit score, how much is it going to move the needle in dollars and cents of that gross revenue? So that's what we're able to quantify.
Wow. Yeah. That's really putting the information up, in a powerful application. So when it comes to the selection piece, how do you tie the psychometric to pre-hire decisions, and what kind of weight should that carry? Tell me a little bit about the validity of using these models in that pre-employment decision-making process, for example.
Absolutely. So first of all, you're using a valid assessment tool. It's been around for a long time. Tens of thousands or millions of people have gone through that assessment. It's been used in all different contexts and applications for thousands of different positions, right? Okay, that this is an assessment that has been tried and tested. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
Then you look at the piece of the performance modeling, and the performance model is going to be built and it's going to be validated within that.
Right.
So we need to do that step between the reliability of the assessment and the validity of the performance model. So if the government says that for the assessment itself, they look at what's called a correlation coefficient. And it's a number between 0 and, just to simplify it.
Right.
So the government says that for reliability, that the instrument, is if you apply it today and you apply it in 6 months, you're going to get similar results. Or that the items that load with a certain factor or attribute or scale are internally consistent and you're measuring the same thing, right? So reliable. That is 0.70. That's adequate. Anything below that may have limited applicability, and the government will say, well, maybe that's not a test that's reliable enough to be implemented.
Right.
And then, the coefficient 0.8, that's good, and above 0.9 is excellent. So let's take an instrument that you and I have worked with for many years.
Sure.
And it's if you look at the average, it's got a reliability of about 0.76. Okay, so reliable. Okay, it's past the standards, adequate. Some of the scales are in the good range, and we might have one that's excellent. If I multiply that coefficient by itself, I square it, that 0.76 becomes 0.58. So that's the ceiling, that's the upper limit. I will never get usefulness or validity measured by a correlation coefficient that's higher than 0.58. So we just made the jump from reliability, talking about that aspect of how the assessment is built, to validity, which talks about its meaning and usefulness. And so that 0.58, and the government has a table that it published, years ago in 2006. They need to update it, the whole document, but it's a very useful document. It's called Testing and Assessment, a guide for good practices for workforce investment professionals. Yeah. So this is, you're investing your time and your money. And this is published by the Employment and Training Administration, and they basically built, the ONET. So
right.
So now we always said that the decision weight, when you look at assessment data, psychometric assessment data, and you're going to make a decision about someone, and they're in the queue, they're being considered, and before you make that offer and shake someone's hand and say, we'd like to hire you, we say the assessment shouldn't be weighted more than 1/3 of the hiring decision. 1/3, okay, 33%. Well, where does that come from? If I square that 0.58, get 0.33.
Right. Yep. There you go.
That's a decision right there. So we crossed from reliability to the validity ceiling, to then squaring that validity coefficient, 0.58, and that's 0.33. So you'll never really assessments shouldn't be more than 1/3 of the decision.
Yeah. And anyone who is in that industry should, no matter what the tool is, Chris, don't you agree that, and when we talk about assessments being that predictor, I mean, I've been preaching it, my entire career over 25 years, and it's, the past, present, and future. And I talk about that as the future being the predictor, which is what we're trying to do with the crystal ball of assessment, right? And trying to make that prediction of future fit. And then, of course, for those in the audience, that past is that skill, experience, those learned attributes, education, things of that nature. And then the interview being the present interview, and of course, all three of those pieces coming together. In bringing that into a good hire. Let me ask you a question a little bit off of, I've had organizations in talking about some best practices, okay? And I'm interested in getting your opinion on this. So if an assessment gives you a score, right? So, you'll get a percentage score, a number score, and depending on the product, different ways that they give you a result. But let's just say gives you a score, a numeric number. Is it conceivable to say that if you were to go through an interview process and you take an individual, and I know this is somewhat subjective, but at the same time, you look at their past, which is, application, resume, skill, background, all of that information that comes, and you were to have some kind of scoring table, and you score that resume, application, and all that background information, you give that a score based on how it's fitting the position, and that comes up to a numerical score. And then as you're going through the interview and your team is doing the interviewing and you're checking the boxes and equating some scores to that. And I do realize, again, the interview is probably the most subjective part, but you're going through that process, and then you come up with a score there. So you have two scores, and then you couple in the assessment score. I've always thought, and best practices, I've had some organizations doing this, and the results seem to pan out, that the individual with the cumulative score of past, present, and future, typically, more than not, and again, you probably can go run the numbers on something like that, but typically seem to have a overall good fit versus one outweighing the other. Is that?
Yeah, well, absolutely, John, because, people are complex. So you have to look at different dimensions of their personality, the total person. With the assessment, you're going to look at, a cognitive, behavioral, and interest. And then in the other parts of the screening process, you're going to probably have some questions that are really important for this role in the company in the phone screening. You're going to have someone screening and maybe even taking some notes or checking some boxes and rating the resume.
Right.
Then when they come in for a first interview, and a lot of times it'll even be before they take the assessment online, there'll be a person or two that they'll sit with for 20 minutes or a half an hour. That could all be rated and turned into a numerical guide. So when you put all that data together, each one of those inputs becomes an explanatory variable. So instead of just explaining a third of the variability in performance, you might be explaining 40, 50, 60, 70%, 80%. So you could get, when you combine all of the information that human resource professionals are gathering in the screening process, you could become much more predictive of success. And they can really minimize the risk of hiring a bottom performer who's going to just be so disruptive in the organization.
Right. And so you would think that a model of that type would be a good practice for organizations when they're using assessments and combining those three points.
Yeah, absolutely. And the again, that US DOL document from 2006 shows practitioners how to code that and how to score. They give a real example in that document. And if the HR people have not seen that and gone to that, it gives a really good example of how to score different elements in the screening process, designate a total score, and then we would do trendline analysis with that final score.
Now, in your delivery, so and for the audience's sake, because we have both assessment providers, solution providers tuned in, as well as HR professionals. Kunze Analytics, you guys are able to do business with assessment solution providers who may need to contract your organization to do these types of analysis for their clients, but you also could be hired or be retained directly by an organization if, in fact, they want to bring in an outside expert to come in and look at the ROI and the analytics of what's going on within their assessment process. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. I've got basically two different types of clients. One would be the people out there who are consultants and practitioners, and they're using assessments with their clients, and they have a client that would like to know the validity of their assessment. I'll come in and help them with a project to do that.
Right.
And then there are companies and human resource departments that have a lot of information, and they'd like to find out what's most predictive of success.
Yeah.
So I could go directly into the company.
Awesome.
Do that as the statistician type of work.
And for those folks tuning in, I know you're probably saying, Chris Kunze, how the heck do you spell that? And that's Kunze. But don't worry. As always, we're going to have, when we post the podcast on www.hrhireup.com, we're going to have a page there with all of Chris's contact information, as well as links to reach him and reach out to him. So don't panic, folks. You don't have to try to figure out how to spell Kunze right away. We'll get you that information, and you'll be able to reach out to Chris directly. If you are a practitioner or provider, as well as if you're an organization who would really like to dive deep into the ROI, which leads me to, so what do the reports look like? What are the outputs and things of the deliverables that you guys do over there at Kunze Analytics?
Yeah, John, thanks for asking. We've got 6 different elements that seem to be, pretty stable in most reports. Of course, every report is customized, right? So no 2 reports that I'm generating are going to be the same. But we'll start out with a correlation table that will look at what's called the effect size. So the effect size between the assessment scores and the key performance indicators or the data. Mm-hmm. And that's important to interpret properly. I use, again, the Department of Labor's interpretation guide. I'm able to generate, depending upon the size of the sample, how many employees are being assessed in our validation sample, what we would call a concurrent study. The critical values change based upon the size of the sample. So you really need to have someone to look at that's done this before.
Right.
And years ago, we had a PhD that collaborated with our company. When you and I did a lot of work with Profiles International, he wrote a lot of the case studies and the annual newsletter. Well, I remember speaking with him once, and he said, "Chris, you got to learn how to interpret and look at correlation tables." So I began doing that years ago. And then the second element is a red flag zone. I was working with a partner, strategic business partner in Texas. We worked on several projects with very large clients, and he said, "Chris, if the correlation table says that higher is better or lower is better based upon the scale, and someone is in the wrong direction, their assessments shouldn't we red flag that?" And
right.
I said, "That's brilliant. We're going to call them red flag zones," and we would actually put a little red flag graphic on that area. And of course, then those scales have to be critical success factors statistically. Mm-hmm. They have to be, really predictive of the metric of interest, the dependent variable. So in those cases, there will be some scales normally that are very critical, not just the overall job match score, but for interviewing and coaching and moving the culture of the company. You got to know which scales are the most impactful, right?
Yeah, and that reminds me of a saying one of our colleagues that we both work together. He said, everything we measure is important, but some of the things we measure are imperative, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
All the data is important, but some things are imperative, and so
some things are more equal than others.
Yeah.
So that's what we do with the red flag.
So when you're dealing with this, give me an example of what are the types of data that you guys are processing. I mean, is it just personality? I mean, give me a little idea and give the audience some information on what's the data that you guys normally are working with and trying to bring all this together.
Yeah, so, the first type of data that we're working with tends to be the most predictive, and that's the cognitive, okay. The thinking style.
Right.
Going back to Frank Schmidt and John Hunter, you're going to get the highest correlation with performance on the job with knowing the cognitive ability. Mm-hmm. So that is, and I just confirmed that at PSYOP in Chicago with Anders Sjöberg from the University of Stockholm in Sweden, and we were talking about that. He mentioned all the other elements that you measure are going to offer some incremental validity. So once you know the cognitive, then you're going to build and make the solution more valuable by looking at different behavioral traits. And they're behavioral because they are observable to a certain extent, but really in an interview, people hide them. They hide their normal behaviors. They act completely differently when they go to a job interview.
Right.
So these are latent traits, and they're traits meaning that they're relatively stable and don't change much. So basically half the time I'm going to act a certain way. It's just my normal comfort zone in behaviors. I'm going to be so assertive, or I'm going to be, follow the rules and be manageable, or I've got a certain amount of energy that I expend, or the pace at which I attack most work. I'm going to be a certain level of sociability. I'm more reserved, or so forth. So those behaviors, you don't see that in the interview.
Right.
They're latent, they're hidden, and people are coached. They read books. They, all kinds of things to try to give the impression that they think they need to give in order to get hired.
Right.
And so that next aspect, the personality, and I found in my experience, John, over the years, a well-built model in the personality traits section adds tremendous validity to the whole thing, to the cognitive. You have to have both.
Yeah.
You just those sections together are so powerful.
Right. I've always said, you can have the mental horsepower to do the job, which is great, but you may not have the personality or behavior, or you may have the behavior factors, but not the cognitive piece. I mean, so really just measuring one aspect, and Chris, I look at it like this, and I always bring it to terms, and I use the medical profession a lot, and that there are a lot of assessments out there that I consider to be X-rays, like an X-ray. They take about 15 minutes, and they're quick. And what they're doing, though, and an X-ray may be what an organization may need, given the particular situation or the treatment, if you will. But at the same time, X-rays only are one-dimensional. And so when we go from that, we're then looking at what I call to be more of a CAT scan, or that 3D view of individual, which is, cognitive, behavioral, interests, all of the characteristics coming together. And just like a CAT scan, it's diagnostic, it's more in-depth, and it really gives you that total view of an individual. And so when I'm prescribing, or when we're prescribing the right treatment, if you will, for an organization, I like to, kind of give them that gamut, that we have everything from an X-ray to a CAT scan, and we want to make sure we're giving the organization what they need to achieve their business objective.
That's right. And so, the cognitive is so important because it allows the hiring manager to know kind of like the range or the speed with which someone assimilates new information, but also how they communicate, how quickly they communicate. There was a study that I just saw posted down in Chicago at the Society for Industrial Occupational Psychology, SIOP, where they were looking at dispatchers of medical units that would be pilots flying to try to rescue people that had collisions on accidents on the highway, and the dispatcher had a lot of information, and if he or she was a good communicator, a lot of times the results would be much different and they would save more lives.
Wow.
So so the speed with which you communicate information can be totally critical for a job. And then think about personality. There can be personality attributes that can create a safer environment that would, you can predict whether someone is going to infringe upon safety rules, if they're going to get injured or accidents. And in some industries, accidents are fatal. And then you have just horrendous situations with, someone dies. Imagine I had a client, a very large logistics company from Germany, and we were supporting their tanker business throughout Central America. Mm-hmm. And if one of those drivers falls asleep and hits something and that tank explodes, not only the driver expires, but anyone in close proximity to that vehicle is going to die.
Right.
So their main interest was, how can we predict from, behavior, personality traits, someone that's less risky?
Yeah. That risk tolerance, and I talk about that a lot within some of the projects we work on, and individuals, one of the areas we look at is impulsiveness, and how many times, at least in our area, that we'll have a news story break, and someone in a chemical or plant facility goes down with maybe because they were in an environment where there was a gas, and their partner, their working partner, rushes right in without grabbing their gear, and so both go down. Both people go down, and had that risk tolerance been evaluated and coached, and sometimes, as we know, some of those areas that we measure can be coached, but some of it is how we're hardwired, and all the coaching and training in the world is not going to really move that needle. It just depends on, how far that stretch is for that individual. But had that information been known, and maybe just through some coaching and self-awareness, and we call that safety self-awareness, maybe that quick impulse decision would have changed, and you would have had a different outcome, and maybe both people would have been saved,
Oh, yeah. Imagine, I remember years ago, we had a colleague that, did a study and built a model for nuclear reactor operators, senior nuclear reactor operators.
Yeah.
So
you want to make sure those guys, you want to make sure they have that, like I always, my famous term, that occupational DNA to do that kind of work, right?
Exactly.
For sure. Yeah. What do you see, where's this all going, Chris? What's the future of assessments and analytics? I mean, these two they've been distant cousins, right? I mean, they've been walking down on the same path, but the connection, I think, for a lot of organizations hasn't been as deep as where I believe it needs to be, and certainly I think you would agree with that, with being Kunze Analytics. So, where do you see the future of these two paths intersecting?
Right, John. So, analytics is supposed to be a support and an aid to the assessment industry. And it's only one portion, it's the measurement portion that aids something that really has to happen on the human level. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And I think calling something artificial intelligence is a misnomer. It should be called artificial reasoning.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Reasoning is what machines can do really well. They're if clauses. They're going through very laborious type of searches according to rules that the programmer gives, and they'll get to the answer quickly. But what a machine can't do is it doesn't have the other aspect of intellect, which is intuition. It can't know things to be important, even though it can't express or articulate that. And the human mind is a spiritual thing. It's not just the neurology in our brain, our physical brain, but we're also spiritual beings. And so we have access to information that we know. And actually, the part of the intellect that's the most human is really that intuition. But then the reason, once we understand a concept and another concept, and we put them together, now we're reasoning, and we're creating a premise one, premise two, and then we're drawing conclusions. The old syllogistic reasoning. So you have both elements in the human intellect. Now, the human part is where the human resource professional is going to be talking with the rest of the company, and they're going to be basically doing an appraisal of the knowledge, the industry knowledge, the company knowledge, the client knowledge, the product knowledge, all the different types of knowledge that is there. Now, you can have a machine, you can give it thousands of variables, and it'll go on a fishing expedition for those variables that could be important in predicting something mathematically, but totally miss the boat.
Right.
They could be pulling fish out of the water, whereas over here you've got these huge big fish that you could be catching if people would just get together, communicate, and understand the value of everyone's brain. And so that the intellect, the intuition, combined with the measurement capabilities, and over the last 150, 200 years, the whole statistical methodology is supposed to be a supportive role. So you've got basically people who are observing, understanding the qualitative aspect of business being conducted.
Right.
They know interiorly, whether they can express it or not, they'll know what's important, what has to be done, what's absolutely essential to get my product across and to make sure that customers are happy, clients. And then when you marry that with the statistics, you basically have hypotheses. Well, I think this is important. Well, I can look at that statistically and come back and say, yes, you're absolutely right. And that's what's so beautiful, because, people think, I've done this for 25 years. I've been in this position, or even though I'm new in this position, I read something during my education, and I had this professor that says, and I really think this is going to be important. Well, we can test those hypotheses.
Yeah.
And we can come back and say, you thought this was this. Actually, there's another aspect. The second one that you mentioned is more important, and it's 3 times more important. So that's where you get this beautiful marriage of quality and the quantitative sciences to come together. Now, the other aspect of this is artificial intelligence, or artificial reasoning, as I say. And what HR people don't know is they don't have to buy any sophisticated software. They have it right in Microsoft Excel.
Right.
There's a beautiful add-in that they can enable called the Solver. Frontline Solver company was a small company in Nebraska that Microsoft bought, and they've got all types of add-ins that you could purchase. But the free one that comes with the software has an evolutionary engine. And if you put in your constraints and you'd like to maximize, minimize, or obtain a certain result, it can do AI optimization with an evolutionary engine. And nobody knows about this. A lot of people don't even, enable that. I was just reading a paper this morning by a AI journal in which they were talking about how the solver, could be used. So not to be intimidated by talking about AI.
Sure.
But it's
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's about communication. It's about reaching out for support. Like Kunze Analytics is there to help you validate your intuition and your understanding, because only you know the business as a company.
Well, and I can tell you, and you and I have worked together for, a decade, and the information that you have provided to, at least I know my clients in particular, those are the organizations that when you start getting into the analytic aspects and they start to understand how this information can really be used, I can tell you those companies that have engaged this type of analytic work are without a doubt the clients that are deeply engaged and are using the assessment tools at an entirely different level. And with that, I can tell you, folks, that if you are using an assessment, and it doesn't matter if it's a product that I provide or other practitioners provide, or you're using a different type of instrument, whatever you're using, the backside is, what's the end result, or is this information, certainly you're making it to use some service decisions. But when you start to get into the analytics and really dive deep, now you're starting to move from checkers to chess, and it's much more strategic in what you're doing. So with that, Chris, in closing, what's the main idea you would like to leave, assessment practitioners like myself, as well as clients that may be listening today, organizations who really want to take their assessment usage and understanding to what I usually say a higher level. And that's part of our slogan here at Higher Up, taking your business to a higher level. But I'm gonna give you a new slogan, and that's taking your organization to analytical level.
Analytical level.
I like it, huh? There you go. Hey, no charge.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's wonderful.
All right.
And it reminds me of a project I did with a school district and built models based upon the learning gains. And these were models for elementary, middle school, high school teachers, and then we also build it for principals based upon the learning gains of students. So that kind of blows your mind when you think of all the different types of KPIs you could have.
In fact, I remember that project. I remember you and I having discussions about that project. That was
Yes.
that was phenomenal work.
Well, it was, and it's exciting, but it brought, and you and I were involved in the education industry, servicing clients in that whole space. And I wanna make reference to Michael J. Ufferman. Now, he used to be the chancellor of Capella University. They were a client for a time, and he was also in the University of Wisconsin system as a professor. So what he did, he got with a statistician years ago, and I read this in a trade journal. He was interviewed, basically worked, and he said that you could look at behaviors of the students who had gone through their programs before, and you could figure out at a very simplistic level what in those behaviors might be predictive of their finishing, the study program or dropping out of school. And these were all, 2 and 4 year programs.
Mm-hmm.
By applying some assumptions and developing an algorithm, they were able to work with a run of data that would have been in a 90+% predictive position. That means that more than 90% of the time, they could predict what happened to someone based on looking at these behaviors that they identified as being critical variables. And so Mr. Michael Ufferman's main suggestion to the industry for HR, and that would be mine also, which I embrace, is that find colleagues in your company, business, or organization that are the numbers people. Find them.
Mm-hmm.
Get them collaborating with HR and with the chief people officer, because HR analytics, and this was written back in I think 2012, it's still in its infancy, and I don't think it's advanced that much yet. We still have a long way to go in HR applying analytics. It's not so much about buying sophisticated software packages, but acquiring the skills to observe work reality, to make a hypothesis, and to test it statistically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's good. That's good stuff. And so, so Chris, go ahead and take a little time. So give us your website address. What's your organizational website?
Yes, it's kunzeanalytics.com, Kunze analytics.com. And you can go there and you'll find my email address and telephone number here in the Madison, Wisconsin area.
Great.
So we're ready for working with companies. I've got experience with working with companies in many, many industries and of all sizes. Whether you have just a few employees all the way up to several thousand. I mean, you and I, John, we had a client that would hire 600 people every year to a single position. They had about 2,400 of these, and it was a sales position.
Right,
really.
right.
So they, when we worked on analyzing the value of that model, that sales model, I had 1,000 data points and 2 years of sales performance for 1,000 people. Now, because they had over 100 locations in Canada and the U.S. There's turnover among the HR people. We found that 30% of the locations had hired without using the assessment.
Right.
But those that did, every hire was worth about $45,000. So basically, it paid for the base salary of each of these salespeople. So those companies that didn't use assessments were missing out on that. And really, that's my experience. When you build a sales model, if it's done right and validated and you get the metrics, you should be paying for the base salary of any sales or service person. And that's really where our goal needs to be, to quantify the value, optimize the performance model used, and to do everything right and talk about and go back after a year, year and a half and see, did we achieve the goals and the outcomes, the business outcomes that you wanted when you bought our software?
Right, right. Well, there you have it, folks. Chris Kunze with Kunze Analytics. And I can tell you, I have personally had experience with Chris, not only with our time with Profiles International and Wiley, but just individually working with Chris on projects. And if you're ready to really start to jump in and look at this data and going, deep beneath the surface data and seeing how you can make true decisions and really move your organization to another level, I can tell you, I highly recommend Chris Kunze Analytics. And so, Chris, I want to thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedule, putting your calculator and pen and spreadsheets down for a few minutes and and spending a little time with us and our listeners here on Higher Up.
That's great. Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate it.
All right, Chris. Look, and again, folks, we know that you have a choice when choosing your listening content. And again, we want to thank you for joining us at hrhigherup.com. Our goal is to help you take your organization to a higher level. This is John Beck signing out.
Thanks for listening to Higher Up with John Beck.
For show notes, updates, and more on how to break the code to unlocking occupational DNA,
Join the community at hrhigherup.com.
and take your business to a higher level. This has been an exclusive production of SharperTalkMedia.com. Join the community.